Honorable Justice Ujjwal Bhuyan, Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Sharma, members of the faculty, registrar, and my dear young friends. I must thank Justice Bhuyan for this introduction and also mentioning about the fact that I like James Bond and I went to Everest Base Camp. And only one correction, I am not the former Additional Solicitor General. That maybe unless you are prepared by artificial intelligence. So that could be a thing. So not just, my input. Yeah, anyway, I've never been a law officer in my life. Interestingly, since you mentioned about James Bond and trekking, I just mentioned another interesting factor, just as on my interest. I appeared for Michael Jackson in the Madras High Court, and I'll start off with that and then I'll go on to the topic. Michael Jackson was performing in Bombay. All of you must have heard the director Mani Ratnam, who's about the Tamil who acted Bombay and so on. Mani Ratnam's brother, Venkatraman, had once engaged Michael Jackson to perform in India. But Michael Jackson got into some controversy. He was shown holding a baby across the balcony in Bangkok or Thailand, and there was a huge international uproar and all the concerts were cancelled. Fast forward 2 years, Wizcraft, which is an entertainment company, was having his concert in Bandra Kurla complex in Bombay. And Mani Ratnam's brother filed a suit for injunction, saying that in the earlier concert I lost so much of money, so till my money is thing, the concert should not go on. He should be asked to deposit so many crores before that concert goes on. And I was briefed to appear for Michael Jackson. I still got his Wakalatnama signed by Michael Jackson. I will trace it and keep it. And very interestingly, the question was whether an injunction could be given. When he said, I lost so many crores. And we ultimately, by the grace of God, we succeeded. The matter went on till 5:40 in the evening for Justice Lakshmanan at that time, and then he dismissed the injunction application. And we relied on a judgment of Justice Chagla of 1953 Bombay, who said that unless damages have been ascertained by a court, there can be no injunction on expected damages or speculated damages. So on that ground, we succeeded and the concert went on. But my wife has never forgiven me for the last, and she won't forgive me as long as they're alive. I was getting 2 passes, VIP passes to attend Michael Jackson's concert. I never followed Michael Jackson. I just heard my son would talk of his famous song and Moonwalk and other things and so on. So I said, I'm not interested. Then the concert went on, so I told my wife I had got a passes, but what's the point in going to Bombay? And I don't understand. She said, you said no to Michael Jackson? And till today she says that you're the most workaholic person, I will never forgive you for that. So, so I bear that cross for the rest of my life. And she wanted to attend the concert naturally. So this is the additional, just grace of God that I could appear for Michael Jackson on that. And incidentally, I've got the agreement which is there. His equipment comes in one jumbo jet. There are almost 110 tons of equipment, music, this, that, and so on. And one interesting clause I'll tell you in the agreement. He says that the tariff, the rates for his concert should not be less than that other lady, not Lady Gaga, who was the other person, famous singer. Madonna. I think this word more than me. So this is an interesting part of one. It's a unique. Not many people will get a chance to appear for Michael Jackson. So it happened, and of all the places in the Madras High Court at that time. Now come back to the topic. I was at Aurangabad to deliver a lecture on at the National Law School there, and my topic was the forgotten struggles to save the Constitution in February. And that time Justice Bhuyan also had come for the lecture with Justice Oak, and he said that you must come one day to National Law School, Guwahati, and give a lecture, and I promised I will do that. I had also one reason, because I was always fascinated by the Brahmaputra river, and I read so much about it, and that it's a mighty river and how it flows and so on and so forth. So I finally fixed 15th of December, and I don't know, some divine intervention. There was a matter yesterday on GST before the Guwahati High Court, And the lawyer called me and said, some matters coming on 14th, will you appear virtually? I said, no, I'm coming for a lecture on 15th, I'll appear physically also. So everything tied together, and now it's a privilege to speak to all the young students. Now, while speaking on this topic, I discussed with Justice Guyan, and I said that no point giving you a lecture on a particular legal topic. That would be boring anyway. Your lecturers are going to teach you law. I said that we can learn lessons from this fascinating legal journey of Palkhiwala. And I just give a brief background. What I propose to do is I propose to tell you part of his early life, which is an inspiration for all of us. And it shows that there is a Palkhiwala in each of us. The spark has to be lit, and you have to relentlessly pursue the goal. Secondly, I will just deal with two of his cases because lack of time. One is the bank nationalization case and the Privy Purses case. Because Keshav Bharati, because all of you have heard so much about basic structure Keshav Bharati, most of us know about it. I may just, if time permits, give a small introduction, anecdote. Now, when Mr. Palkhiwala died, as a student, I attended all his lectures. I used to go for all the meetings of the Forum of Free Enterprise, and he was always a role model for me. I wanted to be a tax lawyer, and that was the real inspiration. When I wrote my exercise book, I went and showed him the book, and I asked him to write a foreword, but he said he was held up. He said he'll write a small blurb on it, but he couldn't write a foreword. In the Madras High Court, he had come to the Income Tax Tribunal for a very important case on investment allowance, and I remember going there at 9:30, catching a place and hearing his arguments. Coincidentally, when the matter came to the High Court, I was engaged and I was supposed to brief Mr. Palkhiwala and go to brief him. Unfortunately, J.R.D. Tata passed away and Palkhiwala had gone to Paris for the funeral, so he could not come. Then I did the case in the High Court and then finally Supreme Court. So I had few interactions with him, but I could never really assist him because of circumstances. 2002 December, Mr. Palkhiwala passed away. In 2003, the Palkhiwala Memorial Trust of Bombay, where Mr. Sorabji was the trustee, they said that they will have two books on Palkhiwala. One was his life, which was written by Mr. Murgaonkar, the eminent journalist, and Mr. Sorabji was asked to prepare a book on his important cases. I had come to Delhi for Science to keep coming off and on at that time, and Mr. Sorabji met me and said, Arvind, why don't you be the co-author of this book? And finally, after almost 7 years, this book was published. Unfortunately, Mr. Sorabji fell ill in between, so I had the task of completing most of the book. But in the course of writing of this book, I interviewed, luckily when he passed away, most of his contemporaries were alive. Justice Y.V. Chandrachud was there, Justice Bhagwati was there, D.M. Popat was there, all people who worked with him were there. And I got an inside information or inside peek at what makes a great man tick. What makes one person reach stratospheric levels of success. In the course of the interview, Fali Nariman told me that many people are batsmen or of the Hobbs class. Hobbs was a great batsman. He said, but there is only one Bradman or two Bradmen. So what fascinated me, what makes a person go from Hobbs to Bradman? What are the things? And I interviewed a number of people. And this person's life was particularly fascinating because he was not the son of a lawyer. His father, I don't know if you know, father ran a laundry in Tardeo in Bombay. So they were not poor, but they were certainly not rich. As Mr. Guyan said, he has a stammer. I had, I don't know how many, 30, 40 meetings with his brother Behram. And Behram told me that his brother could not speak. And he would purposely put almonds in his mouth and talk and kept on training himself. He would deliberately take part in elocution competitions despite his stammer, and over this, by sheer human effort, he overcame and became one of the most eloquent speakers. So the point which you, for all young, I'm now addressing mainly the younger lawyers, younger students, the potential Palkhiwalas in this room, that despite the handicap of a low middle class background, despite a stammer, despite all this, he overcame everything by sheer hard work. He, in the 11th standard exam, he stood first in Persian of all the things. And there's another book called Feshrik which I wrote, And we collected, in his house there was a box of old cuttings, of old articles he wrote, paper called Mast Bahar, Kaisere-e-Hind, Parsiana, all those old 1937, 1938. From the age of 18 he was writing articles. And if you get that book which we have published, Feshtrip, at the age of 19 this man writes about Charles Dickens in such a brilliant manner, about Charles Dickens, Oliver Goldsmith and Hardy. He writes beautifully. So he continuously wrote. There was a relative of mine, Mr. Parsure, who owned Popular Book Depot in Girgaon, in Bombay. Palkhiwala could not afford to buy books because they were not very wealthy people. So Mr. Parsure would allow Palkhiwala to sit down in the evening and read a book and put it back, so he need not buy it. So he was a voracious reader, and this is the kind of thing he read. Fast forward, he went to law. He said that if I had to learn law, I should also know accounting if I had to be a commercial lawyer. That time Income Tax Tribunal had just started in 1941. And he said, let me learn accountancy. Now look at the man, he could not afford accountancy tuitions. So Principal Banaji of Master Tutorial College. Now, one thing you learn, you don't have to be in some fancy school. You don't have to go to Oxford. You don't have to go to Cambridge. Palkhiwala studied in Master Tutorial College. He passed out of government law college. He had no money to study accountancy. So Banaji said, I'll teach you accountancy in the evenings. So he learned accountancy in the evening because he could not afford an accountancy class. And then he stood first. He came first in first LLB, first in second LLB. And in Bombay, you got this OS exam, Advocate OS. There's appellate bar and the original side bar. Original side bar originally only barristers, and appellate side by the other lawyers. So he wrote the OS exam. And there are 6 papers. He came first in first OS and second OS, and each year he got the highest mark in each of the papers. And that's how ultimately he succeeded. One thing which I learned from Palkhiwala's life is, one mantra I learned is, the separation is in the preparation. 100 law students come together, ultimately one or two reach the pinnacle, and 99% of it is because just preparation leads to the separation. That is what I learned from him. Now coming to his life, just as Doyen rightly mentioned, see how a person becomes accidentally a lawyer. Some of us, like I did BSc Honours in Physics and Mathematics, I wanted to go into shipping, but because of medical reasons I was medically disqualified from joining the Merchant Navy. And then I did law, I did Physics and Mathematics, and then did law and cost accountancy. But once I decided to do law, I said I'll be a tax lawyer, and I did cost accountancy in the evening. So I had law in the morning and evening cost accountancy, and that's how it happened. So you start off with planning something, do something else. So those of you who have come to law accidentally or could not get your engineering or medicine, etc., nothing to lose heart. Look at the life of this man. He first wanted to write ICS. The first year, the exam was for some reason cancelled. Second day exam was in Delhi. At that time, unusually, there was a plague in Delhi. Plague, can you imagine? His father said, Nani, don't go, because there were some rumors that there was widespread epidemic and it could affect people and so on. And he was very, very attached to his parents, so he did not go. So he missed the ICS exam. Then he finished BA Literature, then he did his MA Literature. He applied for the post of a lecturer in Bombay University, a lecturer in English. One lady scored more marks than him, only one vacancy, so he did not get the job. And when I wrote the book, very often his wife and that lady would go out for lunch or tea, and he always thanked her that, but for you, I would have retired as in the teaching faculty, but I became a lawyer. So finally, his father told him, he said, Nani, take to law. You write well, take to the law. So that's all. So all these things I learned in various interviews, and finally the man becomes a lawyer, and then he ascends to the top. Now, one thing I learned was the extraordinary hard work that he did. Jangu Gagrat, then partner of Gagrat and Company, his father Rustam Gagrat gave Palkhiwala the first plaint to draft. He gave the papers and said, these are the papers, draft the plaint. It's a big bundle. They thought it will come back in 1 week or 10 days. 48 hours after that, the entire plaint was ready, remarkably drafted. So that was the thing. He joined the bar in 1946. In 1950, 4 years as a lawyer, just imagine you join the bar in 4 years, he purchases a 3,000 square foot apartment on Nariman Point. Can you imagine the amount of meteoric success that he had at the bar? Nariman told me that Justice Jamshedji Kanga had a chamber, and in Bombay space is a constraint, so Kanga had a bigger table. All juniors had a small table, about this size. Palkhiwala's work grew so much that he used to hold conference in his Hillman car because there was no place in the tables. That was his meteoric success. Now, I've always believed, I once attended a lecture where a person said, "What is luck?" We say, "No, he's lucky. The luck has helped him." And there's a beautiful sentence that luck is the intersection between hard work and opportunity. Mark Twain said, "Dame Luck knocks at the door of every man, but 80% of them are the neighboring bar, not there available." So Palkhiwala was extremely hardworking, and one case came for, it's called P.V. Rao versus Kushal Das Advani. Advani was a refugee. There was a matter regarding requisitioning, and Palkhiwala was the junior. His senior was R.J. Kola. He argued the case. The very interesting question was, all of us now know of writ of certiorari, writ of mandamus, etc. Before the constitution, there was no writ. But the High Court could grant relief of certiorari under the Specific Relief Act. High Court could grant a certiorari under Specific Relief Act. 3 judgments of the Madras High Court and 1 judgment of the Calcutta High Court said High Courts should not issue writs of certiorari. So they had a difficult case. Kola argued. Sir M.P. Amin was the Advocate General. He replied saying that it is fully covered by 4 High Court judgments. There is nothing for this court to entertain. And Justice Bhagwati, that is P.N. Bhagwati's father, N.H. Bhagwati, was the presiding judge in 1948. This man is just 3 years in the bar. So he said, "Mr. Palkhiwala, I'll hear a rejoinder tomorrow." Behram recollects his brother. I use the word Behram because his brother, and I had interacted with him so deeply. He didn't sleep virtually the whole night. Next morning he started arguing, started raising new points. Now normally you can't raise a new point in rejoinder, you can't take a new point. But look at the grace of Sir M.P. Amin. He said, "My lord, this young boy is arguing very well. Let him raise new points, but permit me to reply to his new points." He said, "All right." So he argued for a day. He started in the morning, continued after lunch. By lunch, the rumor spread in the neighboring college that one young lawyer is arguing very well. So Dhan Palkhiwala, that is Behram's wife, she and other students all rushed to the court to hear who is this young person arguing. Of course, he was already well known because he was a gold medalist now. And believe me, by sheer argument, Justice Bhagwati took a dissenting view. Despite 3 judgments of Madras and Calcutta, Bombay High Court held they could issue a writ of certiorari. It went before Chagla bench. They affirmed that view. So he took this case according to Fali Nariman, turned his fortune completely. As a young lawyer, if you could distinguish 4 major High Court judgments and get a writ of certiorari, it was a spectacular achievement. So what I wanted to impress upon you is, it is up to us as to how hard we want to work. My grandmother used to tell me that the more beautiful a statue, the more hammer and chisel it has been endured. So the more we work harder, the greater is the opportunity ahead of us. So this is his background, and I'll come to some points of advice later. Now let me go to 2 important cases. Bank nationalization case and Privy Purses case. And this shows the work of the man, what he did. Bank, July 19th was a Saturday, 1969. Indira Gandhi issued an ordinance nationalizing the banks. Nobody had a clue because Parliament was going to assemble on Monday. So if you talk of constitutional morality, I would humbly submit when Parliament is going to assemble within 48 hours, you should not issue an ordinance. Because ordinance is issued only when the parliament is not in session or the assembly is not in session and you have to pass some urgent law. But she passed the law on Saturday, nationalizing 14 banks. And you know what's the criteria for nationalizing a bank? Any bank which had a deposit of more than 50 crores was nationalized. You can imagine the value of money. Today 50 crores is, apartments are sold for 50 crores. But that time, the top 14 banks had deposits of 50 crore and above, that's all. So these banks were nationalized. R.C. Cooper, Rustam Cooper, was a shareholder of Central Bank, Bank of India and Bank of Baroda. All were limited companies. 19th is a Saturday, it comes on the radio that it has been nationalized. Palkhiwala flies to Delhi. J.B. Dadachandji is a record. I got on an interview. The entire writ petition was prepared in 2.5 hours. Dictated, typed, filed on Monday. Interim order on Tuesday saying that the chairman of bank will not be removed, but the nationalization will go on. And then the bank nationalized case is heard. Now, this was heard by 11 judges, and what I want to impress upon you is the 3 important points raised by this case, which are important for your understanding. I'm just going to deal with 2-3 legal points and then come to the next. And I'll tell you in the end, actually Palkhiwala lost on every count except on compensation, because he highly criticizes bank nationalization. All these judges are capitalists, they are pro-capital, anti-labor. Namboothiri Path wrote a stinking article about the judiciary saying that they are anti-progress, anti-socialist and so on. Now, in bank nationalization, the 3 legal principles, I'll tell you first and I'll say how on most points he lost. In bank nationalization case, the important point which students and all of us should note is that it was a complete radical shift from A.K. Gopalan. I don't know how many of you have completed constitutional law. If you read A.K. Gopalan, and incidentally A.K. Gopalan is AR 1950 Supreme Court page 27. I would request Justice Bhuyan to help me because A.K. Gopalan's writ petition number 13 of 1950. I am trying for the last 10 years to find out what is writ petition number 1 to writ petition number 12 in the Supreme Court. So that's one thing I'm just searching for. But anyway, this is the 13th writ petition. And another man became meteorically famous was Mr. K.K. Venugopal's father, M.K. Nambiar. He argued, he was practicing in the Madras High Court. Now I'll slightly digress, I'll tell you how luck and hard work, that thing I gave you. M.K. Nambiar was a public prosecutor in Udupi. They shifted to Madras. He was practicing in Madras as a civil lawyer and so on. But he was a strong student of constitutional law. Now you must have heard that separation of powers, India doesn't have strict separation of powers, right? All of us studied that. M.K. Nambiar has written an article in 1947 to MLJ. Massachusetts is one of the few states which has got strict separation of powers. Now just imagine a man coming from Udupi, sitting in the Madras High Court library. He studies US Constitution and finds out which constitution has strict separation of powers, writes articles on that. So number of articles have been written by M.K. Nambiar in those days. A.K. Gopalan comes, they brief M.K. Nambiar. Overnight, he becomes the most sought after constitutional lawyer. So again, like Palkhiwala and Nambiar, they had fully worked hard, they have prepared, an opportunity came. The intersection of hard work and opportunity is luck. And M.K. Nambiar never looked back. From 1950 right up to Golaknath, he was the lead counsel in almost all the important constitutional cases. So come back to this. In A.K. Gopalan, the Supreme Court held that each article is separate. Suppose, for example, under Article 31, they can acquire your property. If the acquisition law is okay, then you can't plead Article 14. Suppose, say in Assam, you acquire 6 plots in one area, but don't acquire 4 plots for political reasons. Under the A.K. Gopalan doctrine, if 6 plots have been acquired validly, you can't plead inequality because 14 is separate, 31 is separate, 19 is separate, 21 is separate. So each is in a separate silo. In bank nationalization, please read the judgment of J.C. Shah. See, you're all listening here, but I want you to go back and read these judgments, not just attend it. Unless you read, you will not know the way the arguments have developed. Palkhiwala argued that Article 31 is right to property, 19(1)(f) is right to property. Both, you have to satisfy both the requirements, and he said that all the articles must be read together. The fundamental rights are a body of articles which are interconnected. And that was the argument by Justice Fazal Ali. If you also get a chance, I would recommend, more than the majority judgment in A.K. Gopalan, read Fazal Ali's dissent in AR 1950 Supreme Court, page 27. Brilliant dissent of Justice Fazal Ali as to how you can't take fundamental rights in isolation. The whole body is intended to protect citizens. So Palkhiwala is able to convince the Supreme Court. After 21 years, the Supreme Court held that all these fundamental rights are together, they can't be read in isolation. Second important point which will be useful in all of you is, Palkhiwala put down the object and effect test. Till then the law was, don't worry what's the effect of the law. If the object is okay, if the object is within entry so-and-so of list 1, list 2, that's the end of the matter. Court doesn't have to look into the effect. But he argued that not only the object, but the effect also has to be checked up. On compensation, the law was compensation is not justiciable. You can't discuss the validity of compensation. Palkhiwala was able to convince the court, compensation may not be justiciable, but if the principles are wrong, the compensation law can be struck down. And in bank nationalization, Palkhiwala lost on the ground. He said nationalization can be done by ordinance, went against him. Nationalization was bad, it was upheld. Takeover of shareholding was upheld. The only ground on which he finally succeeded was on compensation, because the compensation was so badly flawed. You'll be shocked to note that they took over all the bank's properties. If you've got a building, I don't know how many of you are from Bombay or Madras, rent control, the property will fetch 500 rupees rent, but it will be worth 1 crore because the rent is controlled. The law said that 12 times your rent is the value of the property. So property worth 50 crores was being taken over for 80 lakhs and 1 crore, something to that effect. To add salt to the injury, this paltry amount was to be paid after 10 years. So that was how the bank nationalization was struck down. Now the next important case, which in my opinion is a blot on our constitution, on constitutional morality, is Privy Purses. Yes. I'll finish in 10 minutes, and then Honorable Vice Chancellor said you may want to ask some questions, so I'm here to answer any questions on any career guide, whatever you want to ask me. Now come to Privy Purses. Now you must have heard about constitutional morality, constitutional values, and so on. According to me, this case is an example of how immoral the entire decision was, and I'll tell you why. One book which all of you should read is Integration of States by V.P. Menon. Integration of States by V.P. Menon. When independence was on the horizon, 48% of then undivided India, that included India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, was governed by princely states. 48% of the landmass was by them, but they had 27% population. 72% were in the presidencies, Bombay Presidency, Madras Presidency, Calcutta. Now, under the Indian Independence Act of 1947, take section 5 and 6, each princely state had the option to join India or Pakistan. They could join whoever they want. In fact, Junagadh and Kashmir first, they had a standalone policy. They are not joining anybody, but that's a different story. V.P. Menon and Sardar Patel, they single-handedly persuaded the princes to join India, they had this principle of, they use the expression, if your areas are in Pakistan, if the princely states are in Pakistan, join the Pakistan state. If you are within the Indian plane, because they had by and large decided what is going to be India, Pakistan, by and large, you be in the Indian state. So they were able to persuade a majority of princes, princely states, to join the dominion of India. Now, why should they join? Sardar Patel and B.P. Menon, and in fact, those who are interested in noting down, apart from integration of states, there is a wonderful biography of B.P. Menon by his granddaughter Narayani Basu. Beautiful book, very touching book of B.P. Menon. He was not an ICS, and he was an Indian, so how these British used to discriminate against him, but it was only Mountbatten and Patel which made him the fulcrum of the movement. But coming back, Sardar Patel told them, we'll give you a privy purse. In return for the privy purse, you surrender your state you join India. And what was the privy purse? The highest privy purse was 43 lakhs for the Nizam. Gwalior, Baroda got Mysore, got about 20 plus lakhs. Out of 554 states, 396 got less than 50,000 per year. And for your instance, the Raja of Katodia in Gujarat got 16 rupees a month. His privy purse was 192 rupees a year. Now, what did the princes give for this? The total commitment of the Indian government was 6 crores per annum for all the princely states. And what did these princes give up? 12,000 miles of railways was simply surrendered to the government of India. 12,000 miles. Buildings, they were each allowed to keep certain number of palaces. If you go to the concordats, the agreements with each state, there will be properties, like say Travancore, there will be properties which they can keep. The family, they will have a complete schedule of properties there. Apart from that, everything is given to the government. So 12,000 miles of railways, aerodrome. In fact, I was in the course of the research, the first airport in India was in Jodhpur International Flight by Maharaja Umed Singh. So many Rajas had their own airports. Airports were given up. And 77 crore rupees in fixed deposits were surrendered to the government of India. So this is the kind of money India got in addition to getting the states. And what did they get in return? 6 crores per annum. Now, right from the beginning, Congress hated the rulers. They said because they were seen to be collaborators with the British. They were treated as British lackeys, British stooges, British puppets. So all the congressmen, because many of them had gone to jail, and these people were living in luxury. So there was a hatred against the princes. But Sardar Patel gives a brilliant speech in the assembly and says, do not cavil, uses the word cavil. Do not cavil at what we are giving up. See what they have given us. And just see that if they had not collaborated with us, India would never be formed. So don't bother about this 6 crores, move on. Now, even after that, after Patel died, Nehru wrote to the princes, please give up your privy purse because it's against socialism. They didn't agree. Finally, what happened was, according to me, in 1967 election, many of the rulers joined Swatantra Party of Rajaji, and many of them won massively against the Congress. In fact, Maharani Gayatri Devi was in the Guinness Book of Records for the largest electoral margin in votes. Maharani Gayatri Devi's name was there. I've seen it in the Guinness Book. I don't know if Guinness Book is still there, but when I was young, every year I would buy the Guinness Book of World Records. Yeah. So now maybe that irked her. Indira Gandhi then passed the 24th Amendment Bill to abolish the privy purses. Surprisingly, she won in the Lok Sabha, but in the Rajya Sabha the bill was defeated. Embarrassing to Mrs. Gandhi. Then what she did the very next day, she had a presidential order issued. It's called the Midnight Order because President Giri was in Hyderabad. The rumor is the order was taken from Delhi to President Giri. He was woken up at midnight. He was made to sign the order saying that Indira Gandhi de-recognized Madhavrao Scindia, Maharaja Fateh Singh and other Holkar, all these Maharajas were de-recognized by a midnight presidential order. This was challenged by Palkhiwala in the Supreme Court, again before 11 judges, and this was finally struck down. What bothers me is this presidential order was struck down. Indira Gandhi did not give up. She passed the 26th Amendment Act, deleting Article 291, 362, etc., which gave privy purses, and ultimately that was upheld. The point I'm making is this is a case of lack of constitutional morality. In the Constitution, these articles are recorded as a solemn assurance that if you give up your princely states, we'll give you all these things in return. And if you go back on your morals, on your commitment, then nobody can ever have respect for you. This sticking to your word is the most important thing. Fali Nariman has written an article. There's a very famous Oxford historian called Trevelyan, Lord Trevelyan. I don't know how many of you know that, see, I'm not an Anglophile. The British did some good things, British some bad things, but whatever it is, they were the colonial masters. They were not here to do charity. So whatever Shashi Tharoor may say that they exploited us, etc. is over. But some lessons we have to learn. Lord Trevelyan notes in his book, and it is quoted by Mr. Nariman, at the height of the British Empire, the maximum number of Englishmen on Indian soil, the maximum, which includes ICS, police officers, army, everything put together, was 1,65,000. And 1,65,000 Englishmen ruled 300 crore Indians at that point of time. How? So Trevelyan says only two reasons why they could rule in such a small minority was: one, the British took no bribes because they were very well paid, and secondly, the British kept their word. Not a single case of a treaty between the Maharaja and the English which has been defaulted by the British. So that is the reason given. And why I think it is a lesson is, once you don't keep your constitutional commitment, then it augurs ill for the nation. You will never keep up your word thereafter. It's a scar which is permanent. Now I'm already done, exhausted my time. This 26th Amendment, bank nationalization. See, the Privy Purses case, the bank nationalization case, they are sought to be overruled by the 24th, 25th, 26th and 29th Amendment. Kesavan Bharati, of course, was a pontiff, was a Mathadipati thing, and somehow his name has now become permanent. Like, Cargill versus Carbolic Smoke Ball Company or something, or Donahue versus Stevenson. Somebody buys a lemonade and becomes permanently immortal. So similarly, for example, now Kesavan Bharati, he passed away 2 years ago. He was just, his mutt had property had been taken over. He succeeded in the Kerala High Court. They passed the 29th Amendment acquiring all his land. So he filed the writ petition. And for your information, Palkhiwala never met Kesavan Bharati at all. And I'll just give a small incident as to how the case went on, and then I'll put it to question answers. Kesavan Bharati, Palkhiwala did the bank nationalization case and the Mandal case free. But in Kesavan Bharati, it was not free, because apart from Kesavan Bharati, because he never paid Palkhiwala, many coal, sugar mills, other mills whose property was being acquired without compensation, they were also challenging. So Palkhiwala, Soli Sorabji, Anil Diwan, the entire team would be in the Oberoi Hotel in Delhi, and they would appear, so they were paid fully for the Kesavan Bharati. He argued for 31 days. 35 days were taken by the respondent, Mr. Nirande, Mr. Sirvai, other Advocate General, and 2 days for rejoinder. So totally, Kesavan Bharati took 68 days of arguments. And I was fascinated to see how the work was prepared. If you see, they referred to 72 constitutions of different countries. 72 constitutions. If you take the SCC, I would, in your library, just make a note, 1973, 4 SCC, page 225 is the judgment, starting of the judgment. But the journal section, page 1, starts with the written submissions of Palkhiwala, Nirende, Sirvai and others. That is really worth reading. And when you start the judgment, you'll find 9 pages of authorities and so on. So what I was told by people when I interviewed Popat and Sorabji and Anil Diwan and so on, he had a system of saying, tomorrow I am going to deal with 4 propositions. On each proposition, which are the constitution is referring to, what are the judgments he is referring to, and everything had to be arranged in sequence. And he would get very upset if the sequence was broken. One day, arguments were going on intensely, and they were saying, okay, proposition 1 is over, 2 is over. For 3 and 4, where are the books? Books were not there. So that was going to reach in half an hour's time. So he said, where are the books? No, it has not come. So they told Popat, rush back to Oberoi and get the books. Now the interesting story, there was no security in those days, no X-ray machine, nothing. Popat goes out, his driver was missing. So there's a Fiat taxi where there is no driver. So Popat gets into the taxi, starts the taxi, black and yellow taxi, goes to the hotel, picks up the books, comes back, leaves the taxi there and goes and takes the book to Palkhiwala. Nobody knew about it also. So this is how things happened in those days. He just took somebody's taxi, public taxi, drove to Oberoi, came back in the taxi with the band and all that, and he ultimately did. So this is how Kesan Bharati won, and finally the judgment came. Unfortunately, it was followed by the supersession of judges, and this is the fascinating legal journey of Palkhiwala, a man who started with very little to his credit, but ultimately reached the pinnacle of success by sheer dint of hard work and hard work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. We can now commence the Q&A session.
Yeah, I stand and answer here. Yeah, you can ask me any question on not only this, anything about your career or whatever you want. See, one other thing I learned about Palkhiwala, which I would impress upon students, is 2 important steps to success in the legal profession are writing and teaching. I learnt law only by teaching at the institutes of chartered accountant, cost accountant, company secretaries and management institute, because of course initially I had no money, there were no briefs. So the only income was from taking lectures and writing articles. I learned that from Palkhiwala's life. Mr. Justice Bhuyan mentioned about the copyright case. When Palkhiwala started in Kanga's chamber, they had income tax work, tribunal had started. But Kanga would not go to the tribunal, he was already 89 years old. So Palkhiwala started appearing in the tribunal, and incidentally, income tax tribunal worked in the mornings only, not in the afternoon. Industrial tribunal worked only in the afternoons. So he would practice in the ITAT in the morning and the industrial tribunal in the afternoon. And his claim to success was writing and teaching. And in the course of my interview, let me tell you that Justice Y.V. Chandrachud was a more popular lecturer than Palkhiwala, because some students said they couldn't understand what he was teaching evidence in the law college. He said it used to go above our head, we couldn't understand what Palkhiwala was saying. But Chandrachud was a much more popular lecturer, he would crack nice jokes and so on and so forth. So this is the background. Yeah, please start.
A very good morning, sir. A very good morning, sir. I am Mirza Adib Ji, I'm a 3rd year student. Sir, my question to you is that amendments like the 42nd Amendment, the 44th Amendment and the 99th Amendment reshape core constitutional characters or core constitutional architecture. Do you think such amendments should require a higher procedural threshold rather than just an ordinary special majority?
Yes, in fact, that is what is flagged by Mudholkar and by Hidayatullah. If you go to Sajjan Singh's case, 65 Supreme Court, they say that paradoxically under Article 368, the provisor talks of articles which require majority plus ratification by majority of states. But for amending fundamental rights, a simple 2/3 majority is enough. So Hidayatullah says that this is a flaw in the constitution. He says, are fundamental rights a plaything of the majority? Can the majority play with it? I agree with you. But now, fortunately, because of the basic structure doctrine, even though it doesn't require ratification by states, amendment to Part 3, it can still be tested on the anvil of basic structure. And if you're interested, go to Sajjan Singh 65 Supreme Court, read the opinions of Hidayatullah and Mudolkar. That's where the first basic feature doesn't come in Kesun Bharati, doesn't come in Dieter Conrad. It comes in Mudolkar's judgment in Sajjan Singh, where he says, what are the basic features? He says basic features are in the preamble: liberty, equality, fraternity, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for your response.
Anybody else?
Sir. Good afternoon, sir. I am a former student of the same university. So I just wanted to ask one question. At your time, it was cost accounting, and when you started how to practice with cost accounting. So in today's world, what would be the ABCs and C's for someone who would like to start on the taxation side? From the very start, what course or whatever possibilities are there on the taxation side?
Yeah. First thing I'll tell you, because I'm in the minority, I'm the only person in my family who never went abroad, because I thought it's a waste of time. My grandfather was very upset because that was the thing, everybody has to go abroad and study. So I told him, I said, it's a waste of my time and my dad's money. So no point going abroad. To answer your question, how do you develop practice? Not only taxation or intellectual property or specialization. My advice to everybody is, which I followed, is first, you have to get the basics in civil law. And I would recommend that everybody starts practice not in the Supreme Court, not in the High Court, but in the civil courts. For 1 year, you must practice in the civil court, learn the basics of what's a plaint, Order 7, Rule 1, written statement, trial. And if you get time, it's better to do 1 year in criminal law also. Far more valuable than any LLM abroad. But if you learn basic civil and criminal law, that will stand you in very good stead in future. I learned that from the life of Ashok Sen. Even Palkhiwala, it's not that you're jumping into tax, but if you see, he's appear on the origin side, appear in writs and so on and so forth. But to answer your question, the proper career path would be first work for a year or 9 months in a pure civil office, learn drafting, then go to criminal office, learn bail, and that's where the real India is. I find sorry everybody comes to Supreme Court and they're still hanging around in the corridor not doing anything. Secondly, try to do as many cases as you can. Once you do civil and criminal as I suggested, then you choose a specialization, either tax or intellectual property or court. And one more thing, don't rush to Supreme Court. Now there are 2 points. In the smaller high courts, I'm not using in a bad sense, but say not like the 4 metros where there is specialization. In smaller high court, there's a great advantage, you learn all branches of law. There is an outstanding lawyer called V.R. Manohar. He's perhaps one of the best in India, in Nagpur. And he has registers. So when I used to write books, my publisher was in Nagpur. So I used to go to Nagpur for 8 days, 10 days again. And I used to always meet Manohar sir. He had these registers. He used to make meticulous notes. And when I last met him 15 years ago, he has already made 21 volumes of notes. So I said, sir, and he was doing criminal appeals, tax, civil, and so on. So he told me, Data, in Nagpur when I started, we had only 6 judges. We had to do all branches of law. And that proved a very big advantage for him. So, even if you, I would say, even if you practice in a smaller high court, not the 4 metros, it has got great advantages. And there also you can learn different branches of law. But don't neglect 1 year of trial work. It has, for me, even till today, it has proved immense benefit. It's like working in the outpatient department of a hospital before going straight for neurosurgery. Unless you see the basics, nonsense.
Sir, can elderly students take part?
Pardon me?
Can elderly student take part in that?
Yes. All of us are students.
So, sir, it is just a passing comment from your side that British government never broke any treaty. But there is one Allahabad, Treaty of Allahabad in 1765, which was broken by East India Company.
No, I'm talking of post 1857. Post 1857. No, and this is the view of Trevelyan. I mean, there could be an isolation. What he pointed out was the reason why people would sustain British rule was they were confident that if they sign a treaty with the prince, they will not break it. That's what Nariman rightly puts it. Very nice article by this. Anybody else?
Sir, you were one of the counsels in the Kunal Kamra versus Union of India case, right? If I'm not wrong.
Which one?
The fact check unit case.
Yes,
Kunal
yes,
Kamra
yes,
versus
in
Union.
Bombay High Court.
Yes, sir. So, would you like to share your 2 cents on that particular case and right to and freedom of speech and expression in general in a deeply interconnected world?
Yes. Kunal Kamra, of course, surprisingly, the government, I don't know, they are not taken it to the Supreme Court. We first appeared before Justice Gautam Patel and Justice Gokhale, and it was a split verdict. Justice Patel held in our favor, Justice Gokhale held against us, and then it went to Justice Chandrakar, who is now in the Supreme Court. It was a very, very dangerous case. If we had lost the case, it would have led to very adverse consequences, because Rule 3D4 or Rule 5 said that government could set up a fact check unit. What the composition was, nobody knew. And if they felt that any information was against the business interest of India, now this is completely vague, business interest of India, they could ask all social sites to take it down. And the only remedy was either to go through the grievance mechanism or to file a writ petition. But it would have given a huge power to the government to completely stop any kind of news which is unpleasant or unwanted. Now we are doing a very major case on UAPA, where the point is the definition of unlawful activity is, apart from terrorism, etc. Last part is any disaffection towards India. Now how vague is that? So that's coming up on Tuesday.
Thank you so much, sir.
Good morning, sir. I am Kushal Sarkar, a second year student. So my question is, in our 5 years BLLB course, the subjects like tax law and insolvency law, so these subjects are taught to us from our 3rd or 4th years. So my question is that, sir, can we study these subjects by ourselves or take internships on these subjects from the end of our 1st year or 2nd year, just to know about these things before we study them formally?
No, that will be putting the cart before the horse. Better to get a theoretical grounding in the subject, and then you have to see one thing. At least you people are lucky to have National Law School, their classes go on and so on and so forth. When I was in Madras Law College, first year emergency, all the classes went on time. After the democracy was restored, but unfortunately we was constantly on strike, so many classes were cancelled. So we are all basically self-taught. To answer your question, while you are in college, learn the theory as much as you can. And I was told that in the US, it is 1:3. For every 1 hour of classwork, you must have 3 hours of library reading. That is the ratio, because a professor, the PhD commissioner went to Wisconsin for his PhD. The ratio is 1:3. So if your professor teaches you 1 hour, you are expected to spend 3 hours in the library and read further. So on taxation, patent, trademark, whatever it is, you go to the library and study on your own. Yeah.
So my question was specifically this, that can we study these subjects by ourselves before we reach our 3rd or 4th year?
Of course you can study yourself. Of course you can study. Nothing wrong.
Thank you, sir.
You can study.
Thank you, sir.
Take a basic book on taxation. Take a basic book on intellectual property and study yourself.
Good morning, sir. Sir, I'm Sakit. So my question is that regarding this basic structure doctrine. So many argue that the basic structure doctrine should also apply to the ordinary legislations, and many say that since it's a very abstract term, so it should not apply to the ordinary legislations. So what, in your opinion, should it be made applicable to the ordinary legislations as well, or should it only be restricted to the constitutional amendments only?
I've written an article in Bar and Bench stating that basic structure should apply to ordinary law. According to me, see, basic structure came in Kesan Bharati, 73. The first time basic structure was applied was in Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narendra, that is 75. Now, there they were concerned with the 39th Amendment, which added 329A clause 4. Now, very honestly, they could have simply struck it down as basic structure and left it at that. But Justice Matthew, I still don't know, it's obiter. Nobody asked him that question, that was not an issue at all. He said basic structure won't apply to ordinary law because it's vague and undefined. That was agreed to by Ray and Chandrachud. Both said this is undefined, therefore should not apply to ordinary law. Justice Beg in that Matthew case, in the Indira Gandhi case, dissented and said it should apply. Now subsequently, Kuldeep Nair and other cases have said that basic structure does not apply to ordinary law. But in my article I have suggested it should go to 7 judges because if you take Ismail Faruqi's case, which questioned this Ayodhya acquisition of property, they struck down section 3 and 4 on the ground that what happened in Ismail Faruqi in the Ayodhya Land Acquisition Act, they said all cases of the property shall abate. So they said you can't say that your cases just go, you can't deny a person access to law. So they struck down the section ordinary law on the principle of rule of law, which is part of basic structure. So basic structure was used in this particular case. I've given 3 more examples where they applied basic structure doctrine, including the National Tax Tribunal case. And for me, logically, if a constitutional amendment can be struck down on a vague and undefined doctrine, why not an ordinary law? If it is so vague and undefined, it should not apply to constitutional also. Take for example secularism. Take for example separation of powers. Now suppose tomorrow you have a tribunal to do criminal law. All tribunals, some retired general manager of a bank will be a chairperson and he'll decide criminal cases. Will it not be struck down as part of basic structure? Because it's a part of rule of law, separation of powers is part of basic structure. It will be struck down. But to answer your question, you please see my article. In the Madras Bar Association 1, Justice Ravindran says yes, basic structure doesn't apply to ordinary legislation. But he says, if the law violates separation of powers and rule of law, it will be struck down. It means the same thing. So my view is, basic structure can and should be used to strike down ordinary laws because so many important features like secularism, rule of law, separation of powers, free and fair elections, all these are not in the constitution. But if you make a parliamentary law or state law, court can strike it.
Thank you, sir.
That's it.
Good morning, sir. Since the question of basic structure is propped up, I just wanted to ask you if we had hypothetically distilled the basic structure doctrine to its most essential, would you say that there is one right which is totally non-derogable, cannot be amended under any circumstance?
No, I don't think you can distill it to one ground because according to me, the best explanation is Mudholkar's argument. And if you read Sajjan Singh, the concurring opinion of Mudholkar, what happened in Sajjan Singh, just 2 minutes of your time. In Shankari Prasad, the first amendment was upheld saying that under Article 368, Parliament can amend any part of the Constitution. The word used by Patanjali Shastri, Chief Justice, was Parliament's power to amend the Constitution is untrammeled. That's the word he uses, untrammeled. In Sajjan Singh, by 1965, between 1951 and 1965, the Constitution was amended 17 times. So Sajjan Singh was taken up, and in fact, that's one case Palkela could not reach on time. Anyway, so in Sajjan Singh, Gajendra Garkar says Parliament can amend anything. There is no concept of basic structure. Mudholkar puts this question, or somebody asked. He said there is one anomaly in our Constitution. Fundamental rights can be taken away by a 2/3 majority. No need of ratification. So he says our fundamental rights play thing of a majority. So tomorrow if you get 2/3 majority, you can delete Article 21, delete 19 and so on. But the most, according to me, the 2 finest passages is Vivian Bose in Anwar Ali Sarkar and Mudholkar in Sajjan Singh. Mudholkar starts off by saying, I have a sense of unease, disquiet. No doubt Parliament can amend untrammeled power of Parliament. But Mudholkar refers to a judgment of the Pakistan Supreme Court, Chief Justice Cornelius. That time a Christian was the Chief Justice of Pakistan. And he says that the Constitution's essential features cannot be taken away. So Mudholkar then asks a very important question. He says, yes, Parliament's power to amend the constitution is untrammeled, they can change anything. But in a beautiful passage he says, suppose you take away the right to life, if you take away the right to equality, if you take away the freedoms under Article 19, peace, speech, etc., etc. He's saying, will what remain? Will it be a constitution at all? What is the point in having a constitution where there is no right to life, no right to speech, no right to religion? And then he says, where are the essential features? Where do you get the essential features? And Justice Mudolkar says, look to the preamble. The preamble are the essential features of our constitution: equality, fraternity, liberty, justice. So I would recommend all of you to read the it's not a dissently concurring view of Mudolkar, where he flags this concern that this is dangerous. Mudolkar judgment is a masterpiece, and also see Anwar Ali Sarkar, the judgment of Vivian Bose, or the froth and foam of a masterpiece. So this is my answer. There is no one point, and I think even now our essential features are what the preamble really contains.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, and wish you all the best, and hope to see you. Wish you all a very, very successful career. Don't forget, preparation is the separation. Thank you.